Margaret Higgins Sanger was a New York nurse and a complex social reformer who became one of the most controversial advocates of the 20th century. Margaret Louise Higgins, birth control pioneer and later activist, was born in Corning, New York on September 14, 1879. She came from a large working-class family. She had a determined spirit with her passionate advocacy. Sanger's early years were marked by hardship and awakening. She attended Claverack College and Hudson River Institute, though financial difficulties forced her to leave before completing her studies. She later trained as a nurse at White Plains Hospital in 1900, graduating in 1902. Her education there shaped her understanding of women's health and social conditions, though her later career would test those lessons in the most challenging ways imaginable. Margaret Higgins was the sixth of 11 children born to Irish Catholic immigrants Michael Hennessy Higgins and Anne Purcell Higgins. Her father was a stonemason and freethinker who encouraged his children to question authority and think independently. Her mother, weakened by multiple pregnancies and the demands of caring for a large family, died at age 50 from tuberculosis and cervical cancer. Margaret believed her mother's early death was hastened by the physical toll of bearing so many children. This belief would profoundly influence her life's work and drive her crusade for birth control. Growing up in poverty, Margaret witnessed firsthand the struggles of working-class families burdened by too many children and too few resources. The experience shaped her worldview and planted the seeds of her later activism. She saw how poverty and large families trapped women in cycles of exhaustion, illness, and early death. These observations would fuel her determination to give women control over their reproductive lives. In 1902, Margaret married William Sanger, an architect and aspiring artist. The couple moved to New York City and had 3 children, Stuart in 1903, Grant in 1908, and Peggy in 1910. The marriage initially seemed promising. William shared Margaret's progressive political views and they moved in radical circles that included socialists, anarchists, and labor activists. However, the demands of motherhood and domesticity left Margaret restless and unfulfilled. She yearned for a larger purpose beyond the confines of home and family. In 1910, the Sanger family moved to Manhattan, where Margaret became increasingly involved in radical politics. She joined the Socialist Party and began writing articles on women's health for socialist publications. She attended meetings at Mabel Dodge's salon, where intellectuals and radicals gathered to discuss art, politics, and social revolution. It was during this time that Margaret began working as a visiting nurse on the Lower East Side, treating poor immigrant women. Her nursing work exposed her to the desperate circumstances of women who lacked access to contraceptive information. She encountered women who had undergone dangerous self-induced abortions or sought help from back-alley practitioners. She saw women worn out by constant pregnancy and childbearing, unable to adequately care for the children they already had. The suffering she witnessed convinced her that access to birth control information was essential to women's health and freedom. The turning point in Sanger's life came in 1912 with an incident that would become central to her personal mythology. She was called to the home of Sadie Sachs, a 28-year-old woman who had nearly died from a self-induced abortion. After Sanger helped save her life, Sachs begged the attending physician to tell her how to prevent future pregnancies. The doctor callously advised her to have her husband sleep on the roof. 3 months later, Sanger was called back to the same apartment. Sadie Sachs had attempted another abortion and this time she died. Whether this incident occurred exactly as Sanger later described it has been questioned by historians, but it became the origin story for her crusade. She claimed that after Sachs's death, she vowed to dedicate her life to making birth control information available to women. In 1914, Sanger began publishing a monthly newsletter called The Woman Rebel. The publication advocated for birth control and women's sexual freedom, directly challenging the Comstock laws, federal legislation that classified contraceptive information as obscene and banned its distribution through the mail. Sanger deliberately courted controversy, using inflammatory rhetoric and refusing to moderate her message. The postal authorities declared the Woman Rebel unmailable and Sanger was indicted on 9 counts of violating obscenity laws. Rather than face trial, Sanger fled to Europe in October 1914, leaving her husband and children behind. She spent nearly a year in exile, traveling through England, France, and the Netherlands. In Europe, she studied birth control methods and visited clinics that provided contraceptive services. She met with Havelock Ellis, the pioneering sexologist who became her lover and mentor. She also met Marie Stopes in England and visited the Neo-Malthusian clinics in the Netherlands, where she observed how birth control services could be provided safely and effectively. These experiences convinced her that America needed similar clinics. While Sanger was in Europe, her estranged husband William was arrested for distributing one of her pamphlets, Family Limitation, which contained explicit contraceptive information. The charges against William generated publicity and public sympathy. Then, in November 1915, the Sanger's 5-year-old daughter Peggy died suddenly from pneumonia. The tragedy devastated Margaret and prompted her return to the United States. Public sympathy over her daughter's death, combined with support from influential advocates, led the government to drop the charges against her in February 1916. Freed from prosecution, Sanger embarked on a nationwide speaking tour to promote birth control. She faced opposition from Catholic organizations and conservative groups, but she also attracted growing support. Her speeches drew large crowds and generated extensive press coverage. She was arrested in several cities for discussing birth control in public, which only increased her notoriety and support. Sanger proved to be a skilled publicist who understood how to use controversy and persecution to advance her cause. In October 1916, Sanger took her most daring step. She opened the first birth control clinic in America in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn, a poor immigrant neighborhood. The clinic was staffed by Sanger, her sister Ethel Byrne, who was also a nurse, and a Yiddish interpreter. They distributed contraceptive information and fitted women with pessaries, a type of barrier contraceptive device. Women lined up around the block to receive services. For 9 days, the clinic operated openly, serving nearly 500 women. On October 26, 1916, police raided the clinic and arrested Sanger, her sister, and their interpreter. The women were charged with distributing obscene materials and maintaining a public nuisance. Ethel Byrne was tried first and sentenced to 30 days in the workhouse. She went on a hunger strike and was force-fed, generating enormous publicity and public sympathy. Sanger was tried in January 1917 and convicted. She was sentenced to 30 days in the Queens County Penitentiary. She served the sentence and emerged more determined than ever. The clinic case was appealed, and in 1918, the New York Court of Appeals issued a decision that, while upholding Sanger's conviction, interpreted the law to allow doctors to prescribe contraceptives for medical purposes. This narrow exception provided the legal foundation for the birth control movement going forward. Sanger recognized that working with the medical establishment, rather than against it, would be essential to achieving her goals. In 1917, Sanger founded the Birth Control Review, a monthly journal that promoted contraception and related social reforms. The publication continued until 1940 and served as the primary vehicle for birth control advocacy during those years. Through the review, Sanger promoted her increasingly controversial views on eugenics and population control, positions that would later tarnish her legacy. In 1921, Sanger organized the first American Birth Control Conference in New York City. The conference brought together doctors, social workers, and activists to discuss contraception and reproductive health. The event culminated in a mass meeting at Town Hall, which police shut down on orders from the Catholic Archbishop of New York. Sanger was arrested on stage, creating another publicity triumph for the movement. The incident demonstrated the power of the Catholic Church's opposition to birth control, but it also showed that Sanger had influential supporters willing to defend her. Following the conference, Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, which would later become Planned Parenthood Federation of America. The organization worked to change laws, educate the public, and establish birth control clinics. Sanger served as president until 1928, building the organization into a national movement with chapters across the country. In 1922, Sanger married J. Noah Slee, a wealthy oil manufacturer who was president of the 3-in-1 Oil Company. The marriage was unconventional, with Sanger maintaining her independence and continuing her activism. Slee's wealth provided crucial financial support for the birth control movement. He funded clinics, publications, and legal battles. The marriage lasted until Slee's death in 1943, though the couple spent much time apart pursuing their separate interests. In 1923, Sanger opened the Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau in New York, the first legal birth control clinic staffed by doctors in the United States. The clinic operated under the medical exception established by the 1918 court decision. It provided contraceptive services to thousands of women and conducted research on contraceptive effectiveness. The clinic served as a model for others established around the country and demonstrated that birth control services could be provided safely and professionally within the medical system. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Sanger traveled extensively, promoting birth control internationally. She organized the first World Population Conference in Geneva in 1927 and helped establish birth control movements in numerous countries. She visited India, Japan, China, and other nations, advocating for population control and women's reproductive rights. Her international work established her as a global figure in the birth control movement. However, Sanger's advocacy increasingly incorporated eugenic arguments that reflected the prejudices of her era. She argued that birth control would reduce the number of children born to those she deemed unfit, including people with disabilities and those she considered genetically inferior. She spoke before eugenic organizations and published articles in eugenic journals. While she rejected the extreme racial theories of Nazi eugenics and advocated voluntary rather than coercive birth control, her association with the eugenics movement has remained controversial. Modern scholars debate the extent of her eugenic beliefs and their relationship to her broader advocacy for women's reproductive freedom. In the 1930s, Sanger focused on changing federal laws that restricted birth control. She lobbied Congress to amend the Comstock laws and allow the distribution of contraceptive information and devices. In 1936, the movement achieved a major legal victory when a federal appeals court ruled in United States v. 1 package that physicians could receive contraceptive materials through the mail for legitimate medical purposes. This decision effectively ended the federal ban on birth control and opened the way for wider distribution of contraceptives. As Sanger aged, she gradually stepped back from day-to-day leadership of the birth control movement, though she remained its most prominent advocate. In 1942, the American Birth Control League and the Birth Control Clinical Research Bureau merged to form the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Sanger served as honorary chairman but was no longer actively involved in management. Younger leaders took over the organization, professionalizing its operations and expanding its reach. In the 1950s, Sanger became involved in what would be her final and perhaps most significant contribution to reproductive rights. She helped raise funds for research into oral contraceptives. She introduced biologist Gregory Pincus to Catherine McCormick, a wealthy philanthropist who funded Pincus's research. Their collaboration led to the development of the first birth control pill, approved by the FDA in 1960. The pill revolutionized contraception and women's reproductive freedom, fulfilling Sanger's vision of a safe, reliable, woman-controlled method of birth control. Sanger spent her final years in Tucson, Arizona, where she had moved for health reasons. She suffered from various ailments including heart disease and tuberculosis. Despite declining health, she remained engaged with the birth control movement and continued to advocate for reproductive rights. She gave interviews, wrote letters, and received visitors who sought her wisdom and blessing for their work. On September 6, 1966, Margaret Sanger died in a nursing home in Tucson, Arizona. She was 86 years old, just 8 days short of her 87th birthday. She died knowing that the cause to which she had devoted her life had largely succeeded. Birth control was legal and widely available in the United States. Millions of women had access to contraception. The sexual revolution was transforming American society, though not always in ways Sanger had anticipated or endorsed. Sanger's legacy is complex and deeply contested. To her supporters, she was a courageous pioneer who fought for women's reproductive freedom against enormous opposition. She defied laws, risked imprisonment, and endured vilification to give women control over their own bodies. She founded organizations and opened clinics that provided essential services to millions of women. She helped develop and promote contraceptive methods that transformed women's lives. The birth control movement she built became the foundation for modern reproductive rights advocacy. To her critics, Sanger's legacy is tarnished by her association with eugenics and her troubling statements about race, disability, and population control. They point to her speeches before eugenic organizations, her articles in eugenic publications, and her advocacy for restricting reproduction among those she deemed unfit. Some critics accuse her of racism and genocide, though historians debate the accuracy and fairness of these charges. The complexity of her views and the historical context in which she operated make simple judgments difficult. Modern scholars recognize that Sanger was a product of her time who shared many of the prejudices common among progressive-era reformers. They note that she advocated voluntary birth control rather than coercive sterilization, and that she worked to provide services to poor women and women of color. They acknowledge that some of her rhetoric was troubling while arguing that her primary motivation was improving women's health and freedom. The debate over Sanger's legacy continues, reflecting broader debates about how to evaluate historical figures whose accomplishments were intertwined with the prejudices of their era. What remains undeniable is Sanger's enormous impact on American society and women's lives. She almost single-handedly created the birth control movement in America. She challenged laws, defied authorities, and mobilized public opinion. She built organizations that endured and expanded after her death. She helped make contraception accessible, acceptable, and legal. She changed conversations about sexuality, reproduction, and women's rights. Her work laid the foundation for later advances in reproductive freedom, including the legalization of abortion. Sanger's personal life was as complicated as her public legacy. Her marriage to William Sanger ended in divorce in 1921. Her relationship with her children was strained by her devotion to her cause. She had numerous affairs throughout her life, believing in sexual freedom for women as well as men. Her personal choices reflected her rejection of conventional morality and her insistence on women's right to control their own lives, including their sexual lives. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Margaret Sanger recognizes both her achievements and her flaws. She was a woman of fierce determination who devoted her life to a cause she believed would liberate women. She succeeded in ways that transformed society. Yet she also embraced troubling ideologies and made statements that reflected the prejudices of her era. Her legacy includes both the enormous good she accomplished in making birth control accessible and the problematic aspects of her advocacy that continue to generate controversy. Sanger represents a particular type of social reformer, the single-minded crusader who pursues a cause with absolute conviction. Such figures often accomplish great things precisely because they refuse to compromise or moderate their message. But their very intensity can also lead them into troubling territory. Sanger's tragedy, if it can be called that, was that her advocacy for women's reproductive freedom became entangled with eugenic theories that diminished her legacy. In the end, Margaret Sanger was neither a saint nor a villain, but rather a complex historical figure who changed the world in profound ways. Her legacy includes both the birth control movement she created and the controversies that continue to surround her memory. She is remembered today primarily for making contraception legal and accessible, though the debates about her motivations and methods persist. Perhaps that complexity itself is her truest legacy, a woman whose life and work resist simple categorization or easy judgment, demanding instead that we grapple with the full complexity of history and human motivation.